And we continuously put out messages of it's okay not to be okay. That's why we have people like myself on staff. And yet, I think that there's just still hesitation, there's still barriers. So, in my mind, I was like, all right, well, I saw what cognitive processing looked like in the community when I was working with folks who had been traumatized. And now I'm with a population who is already much more closed off. I need to figure something else out. I need to approach this in a different way.
We are joined today by Dr. Leah Kaylor, who is, well, I'm going to let her describe it. Leah, how would you describe what you do if someone were to ask you?
I do a lot of different things, but I would say if I had to distill it down into just a sentence or two, I'm a licensed clinical and prescribing psychologist for the FBI. My specialties are trauma, sleep, and prescribing medication.
Hmm. How did you get interested in a profession such as that?
Oh, well, to be honest with you, I wanted to do medicine, or I thought I wanted to do medicine. And then in high school, we had to do a shadowing experience. And like, my parents got me this like sweet gig where I got a chance to follow um, surgeon. So we were doing, it was an orthopedic surgeon, and I got a chance to like fully scrub in, like go into the operating room. We were doing like this reconstructive knee surgery. And I was thinking like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Yeah, this is so awesome. And then like all of a sudden, just like a piece of like bone flipped up onto the surgeon's gown. And I was like, oh, I don't feel so good anymore. And then I basically like woke up in the nurse's station with like cookies and juice and soon realized, oh, actually I don't think that I can have an occupation with bodily fluids. So we had to course correct. So I didn't always think that I was going to be a psychologist.
Hmm. Yeah, so you had a pretty formative experience with the viscerality, let's say, of what it takes to help to heal someone. And then, but it sort of sounds like that interest of I want to be able to help did manifest in kind of a different way. What did that look like?
Absolutely. So again, like my journey to where I ended up was a lot of different things. Um, I took a psychology class in high school and just enjoyed it, thought it was really interesting, but still didn't put the pieces together that that's what I needed to be doing in college. And it wasn't until maybe like my second or third year that I realized that psychology was going to be my thing. And then I had a feeling that it was going to be something on the fringe, something unusual. And so again, I had to do another shadowing experience. And my mom works at a maximum security all male prison, and she got me an internship. And I followed the psychiatrist and the psychologist around for about 6 weeks and just got a really insider view, like kind of like this peek behind the curtain of very serious mental illness uh, and I thought that that was what it was that I was going to want to do, was to be a psychologist in a prison. And again, after that 6 week experience, I felt very upset with myself because I was like, oh, I knew early on like I couldn't hack this. Like I completed the whole thing, but I knew that this could not be a career for me, that this was very anxiety provoking and
Hmm.
just like far too high intensity of a environment for me to have a sustainable career. So I mean, we can keep talking. I've had a lot of experiences like this where I finally fell into what it was that I where I am now.
Yeah, usually, at least in my personal experience and a lot of folks that I talk to, especially among the health coaching crowd, there was sort of that spark in them of like, I know I need to turn this thing that I have to help into something that's productive. It's sort of like the whole idea of ikigai, right? It's that Japanese term of what are you good at? What's the world need? What can you get paid for? And what are you passionate about, I think is the other one. And so it sounds like the position you're sort of in now is a bit closer to what you've been after. And indeed, this sounds like very, niche to say the least. So talk to us a little bit more about what does it mean to be a psychologist within the realm of the FBI world?
Yeah, so everything that I say here are my own thoughts, opinions, beliefs, biases, and does not reflect anything with the beliefs of the FBI. They're not sponsoring this, they're not endorsing it. But in a nutshell, what it is that I do is that I am on staff, and so I provide therapy services for our agents, our professional staff, our task force officers, and then also sometimes family members. That could also not just look like one-on-one services, but there are times where we do groups. There might be times where we do crisis intervention and a lot of presentations and psychoeducation too. So that's primarily what it looks like.
Okay, gotcha. So a lot of it sounds like very similar counseling type services, except with a very specialized audience, let's say. And
Yes.
so I'm curious, you have some clinical experience, and the title of this webinar has to do with innovative approaches. I'm curious in your perspective, where do you see the sort of older or maybe even more current models doing well versus where is innovation needed? Like why do we need innovation in this area?
So I'll talk about my own personal experience. And when I talk about this, I want to just be clear that everyone is going to bring something unique to the table and what it is that they need from therapy and what's going to work for them and what doesn't work for them. And that's the beauty of having all these various different therapeutic approaches. But one thing that I'll say is when I was doing my PhD at St. Louis University, I was trained in traditional trauma work and I was trained in cognitive processing therapy. And if you're not familiar with that, it's very manualized, it's very structured. We go through a set of models or modules, excuse me, and it may be a model or module about intimacy or about power and control. The person tells their story and they tell their story over and over and over again. And part of that just felt very like it's obviously evoking a lot of emotion because oftentimes whenever you have stepped up to the plate to do trauma therapy, it's not a fun experience. It's like you're retelling probably the worst thing that's ever happened to you is oftentimes what it is. And that's one thing that as I was sitting across from folks doing this, I was like, obviously I can see your pain, but this is just painful and I don't know that it needs to look like this.
Hmm.
Um, and for me, it just felt like there has to be something else. This is very intense, but not only is it so intense that it causes a lot of people to drop out of therapy. That's a huge piece of what we end up seeing is, finally these people have worked up the guts to come to do trauma work, and then it is just extremely provoking, and a lot of people drop out.
Hmm.
So in my mind, I was like, well, there's gotta be something else. And there are, I didn't create anything. Um, so when I got to the Bureau, this isn't news or, top secret. Whenever you're working with law enforcement, public safety, folks like that, it is challenging to get people to open up to you, especially me being on staff. There's already a lot of stigma around mental health, and then I think there's a lot of stigma whenever it comes to law enforcement and like letting your guard down and saying that you have an issue. And I think across the board, any type of public safety, I think people fear of, losing their gun, losing their badge, losing their clearance, whatever it is that they've got to risk, if you will. And we continuously put out messages of it's okay not to be okay. That's why we have people like myself on staff. And yet, I think that there's just still hesitation, there's still barriers. So, in my mind, I was like, all right, well, I saw what cognitive processing looked like in the community when I was working with folks who had been traumatized. And now I'm with a population who is already much more closed off. I need to figure something else out. I need to approach this in a different way. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
I started by going and being trained in EMDR, which then eventually led to certification in EMDR. And that is a wonderful technique. I think that a lot of people don't know this, but EMDR was created back in the 1980s. It was Francine Shapiro's dissertation, essentially. Um, and how it all came to be, because I think that this is just a really interesting story, is that she kind of goes on this infamous walk in the park and Francine is diagnosed with cancer, and she's just obviously feeling very distressed, kind of worried about what the future is going to look like for her. And she goes on this walk in the park. And as she's walking, her eyes are moving back and forth on the path as she's moving. And she notices that after a while, thinking about this just distressing cancer diagnosis, walking on the path, eyes moving back and forth, she starts to realize that she is feeling a little bit better. And she thinks, okay, there has to be something to this. And she's in school to be a mental health professional, and so she brings people into her lab to kind of test, like, what is this? What was happening? Can this be replicated on other people? And so what she does is she asks people to think about something that's very distressing to them, and then she would move her fingers back and forth horizontally across their visual field. And she also noticed that as she did this and they were telling their story and she was moving her hand, that their distress also went down too. And so that was kind of how EMDR was founded. And again, that was back in the 1980s. So fast forward, people right now are starting to think that it's very trendy. And it is, I would say, trending. However, it's been around for a long time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is interesting to hear stories about when someone is able to kind of solve their own problem, they think to themselves, like, I bet other people have this problem, and then that becomes the story of a solution, much, much more broadly speaking. You mentioned before about the idea of how, with, especially it seems like with first responders and a certain demographic that, and I can't tell you how many veterans I've talked to who say something
Yeah.
like, talk therapy doesn't work for me.
Mm.
And yeah, and the challenge of that is like on the one hand, the whole idea of confronting what happened to you in the past to make sense of it is absolutely necessary. We know this from, for example, our like recent research in neuroscience has shown that in order for a memory to quote unquote consolidate and be placed into a proper place in the mind, you have to kind of approach, it's almost like a, well, in some cases, not almost, it is sort of this approach, like a sort of fear approach or desensitization process where you have to confront that dragon in order to subdue it. However, what I'm hearing from you is that, sometimes taking the direct approach is not quite the way to do it because either there's not enough trust in the relationship or especially for men, we're not necessarily as good about like putting words to those things. And so having a more sort of physiological, i.e., you're doing something with your body. In this case, it's moving your eyes around. It is kind of that kind of what would you say, indirect approach that can kind of open the door. It's like healing can come through the back door in that way.
Yeah, yeah. So let's keep it with EMDR for a hot second, and then I'll tell you about the other innovative techniques. But so I didn't actually tell you what EMDR stands for. So if there are people out there listening, EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and that's exactly what you're asking about is desensitization. And so we are still getting at the element of processing, of talking about what it is that has happened to you. Well, there's certainly less talking whenever it comes to EMDR, but it's not a silent process by any means. But we are moving, either we're moving the eyes as we're watching the therapist's fingers go back and forth. I don't do that there after a while, and especially if you have session after session after session, your arm just gets super tired. So there's light bars that we use. You can also use headphones, and like a tone plays in one or the other. I have something called tappers, and basically they're just like little like Bluetooth things that go in the hands that buzz back and forth. So any type of bilateral stimulation, and I also need to define that word too. Bilateral stimulation is just like a fancy dancy word for moving both sides of the body at the same time so that we're activating both hemispheres of the brain at the same time so they can talk to each other. So what we, again, the brain is our most mysterious device in the whole entire world, but what we generally think that we know is that the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and when we're moving both sides of the body at the same time, or we're, having stimulation on both sides, that we're activating both hemispheres and that they can talk to each other.
Mhm.
So there's several different pieces that are coming along, and that's one of them. Also, when we're doing trauma therapy, there's needs to be this element of, I don't like using the word safety, but as safe as we possibly can get, because there are just some people who lots of things have happened to them and they're not really sure what safe feels like anymore.
Mhm.
So we try and create a very contained, as safe place as we possibly can. We're reviewing what it is that has happened. We have the bilateral stimulation. And with the bilateral stimulation, like there are some people out there who say like it's just a distraction so that your mind can't fully process the trauma all at once. And so it's a distraction. There are also theories out there to, and like bringing it back to sleep, which is my favorite topic, is REM sleep. And REM stands for rapid eye movement. And how do we know when someone's in REM sleep? Is that their eyes are moving back and forth underneath their eyelids. And what's happening in REM sleep, and this is exactly what you asked about, is memory consolidation. And, I'll bring it to sleep, but I'll bring it back, I promise, because we're going to do a whole episode on sleep. But when we've experienced something, let me just go back even further. Every night, whenever you sleep, if you're giving your body enough time in bed, you should be cycling through various different stages: light sleep, deep sleep, and REM sleep. All of them have their own unique and very important tasks. We're just going to talk about REM for a second. REM happens several times throughout the night, but you get more and more and more REM as we get closer to your alarm clock going off. REM sleep is very important because it processes what has happened to you throughout the day. It kind of determines, okay, all these things happen. And obviously, we're taking in so much from our senses, our eyes, our ears, our touch all day long. And the brain needs to figure out what's important, what's trash, like what needs to go into short term, what needs to go into long term, because we can't possibly hold all this information, nor do we need to. So the brain is busy working through all of that. It's busy processing emotions. And so this is where, whenever we get into trauma, the brain is also trying to process something that has happened to us that we consider, life-threatening or traumatic, big T, little t, whatever you want to call it. The brain is processing all every single night. It should be. So whenever something traumatic happens to us, the brain is trying to do its job at night. But if we have cortisol, our stress hormone, that is too high, the brain can't process and it kind of gets jammed up. And so that's oftentimes where we end up with like sleep back fragmentation, or that's where we'll end up with nightmares. And so, the brain tries, and this is where we get into repeated nightmares is, okay, we tried to process something, our cortisol was too high, we couldn't process it, we ended up with a nightmare, we ended up waking up. So the brain is like, all right, let's try again tomorrow night. And it keeps trying, and it's kind of like this broken record. It just keeps getting stuck. And that's one of the many, many pieces that come together of how sleep and trauma go hand in hand, but also how EMDR and eye movements kind of also the theory behind it, if you will.
Mhm.
So I'm going to pause for a minute because I know that I can talk a lot.
Yeah, no, this is all really great. The thing that's standing out for me is the implications of how moving the body in some way affects the mind. And
Yes.
Andrew Huberman talks about this on some of his podcasts, where often the lever to pull is much easier when you're sort of pulling the proverbial lever of moving the body to change the mind. Now, yes, we can talk about doing some CBT and having thought patterns and catastrophizing and realizing when you're doing this and all of that stuff, and that can be of some utility. But sometimes, like, Kelly McGonigal in her book, The Joy of Movement, talks a lot about this, how like moving your muscles even just a little bit, even 5,500 steps a day, spark the release of all of this like internal pharmacy stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
It is kind of interesting how with something like EMDR, we sort of know the application, but we don't know exactly the mechanism. One thing that I think of is like whenever I'm trying to, and I might even do this during this call right now, and you can think about this at home. If you're trying to recall some information, what do you often do? You sort of look up to the side and your eyes dart back and forth, like processing, accessing, where is it? Oh, there it is. And so it's here's another sort of mystery. I don't know if we want to go down this rabbit hole too much, but when you say when you say at night, the brain is processing things that happened during the day
Yep.
or in your past. Um, you might ask, like, so the brain is sorting out what's salient and what's not. What should I pay
Mhm.
attention to? What's signal and what's noise? And it's like, well, who's doing that? I'm not doing that. We say the brain. Is that another person? Is that the subconscious? Is that we want to get Jungian and talk about the collective unconscious of who's making those decisions?
Oh, yeah, we could get Jungian. Yeah.
Regardless, the big takeaway here is that at least as far as sleep is concerned, your body prioritizes resting the body itself during, roughly speaking, the first 4 hours. That's when you hit your deep sleep. And then,
Deep.
as you mentioned before, the if you're not getting into those phases of your eyes doing their thing, or at least your eyes are a manifestation of your brain doing the thing, then you're not healing. You're not getting the memory consolidated in the place where it needs to go and sort of fitting your story together. My question to you here would be, can you speak a little bit more to what does processing mean exactly? When you say like I need to go process, how would you define that?
That's a good question. So let me talk a little bit about what we think is happening with memory, and maybe that'll put the pieces together. So again, brain is super duper mysterious. What we think is happening is we've got the hippocampus, and that is where we believe a lot of memory functions are happening. But whenever something traumatic happens, things kind of go off the rails. So if we just think about our memory on a normal day to day, just say, for example, that we went out to dinner yesterday, I asked you about it, you would have no problem telling me about where you went, what you had to eat, maybe what you saw. You could kind of tell me chronologically, like it really wouldn't be a big deal. There would be unless something significant happened, there would probably be very little emotion. You would kind of just be telling me in your everyday typical voice. Whenever it comes to something traumatic that happens, your brain, the body releases cortisol and adrenaline. Cortisol magnetizes to the hippocampus.
Hmm.
I don't know why Mother Nature did this, but cortisol is toxic to the hippocampus. So, whenever cortisol is attracted to the hippocampus, because something very stressful or life-threatening is happening to us, we end up with memory errors. And that could look like a few different things. So if we think about, I gave you the example of like going out to dinner. If in your mind you could probably see the menu or the table or like other people sitting at other booths. But if something traumatic happened, your brain is going to like zoom in on particular things. So maybe it's like broken glass or a weapon or maybe like the sound of screaming. Like it zooms in on several different things instead of being able to like zoom out and see the whole picture. So there's something going on there that is a memory dysfunction. And then also, whenever we are trying to tell a story chronologically from beginning to end, it's normally very challenging for people who have had, again, some type of life-threatening event where the cortisol is being released. It's normally bits, pieces, hard to, I know that this happened, but I'm not really totally sure. And sometimes we need help filling in the gaps. So it's a little bit all over the place. Another thing too is when you went out to dinner and you had this regular dinner, you could probably tell me, "Oh yeah, we were out to dinner and it was an hour and a half." And it felt like an hour and a half. But whenever it comes to again traumatic events, it may have been a split second, but in actuality, it may have felt like time slowed down, like you were in that moment forever, like you were frozen in time. And so there's a lot of different memory errors that are happening. And so when I think about processing and whenever I think about processing trauma and putting all the pieces together through EMDR or other therapies that we'll talk about later here today, is that it's kind of like putting together all of the pieces and trying to zoom out, trying to get it more chronological, trying to get a better grasp on the time frame for it. But you also said something really interesting, and this is what I normally tell clients all the time is sometimes it feels like the memory is right here, and it's really hard to engage with other people. It's hard to engage with life. It's hard to do the things you need to do because this is right here getting in my way. And when I tell people about what they can expect from EMDR or the other therapy we're going to talk about here today, is it's kind of like I take this memory and I put it back in the memory filing cabinet chronologically where it belongs.
Mhm.
Does this take
Mhm.
time? Yes, it does. But that's what I think about when I'm talking about processing in the context of trauma, in the context of these innovative techniques.
I love the way that you put that and the layer from which you're approaching this idea. When I think of processing, I kind of think of it as like you ever see the movie Memento, sort of an older movie, but like it's if you haven't
Yeah.
for the listeners, if you haven't seen it, basically you have this main character who has talk about fragmented memory.
Mhm.
The viewer of the movie doesn't know exactly what portion of the timeline they're in. And so I think that's sort of an artistic illustration of an unprocessed memory. And
Mhm.
so memory, we think that episodic memory is the only way memory kind of works. Like we can take for granted, like, oh, memory is for remembering things where A happened and B happened and C happened. The problem with that is there's an infinite number of things that you could remember. Even right now, like which pixels
Yeah.
am I paying attention to? Do you know what shirt color I'm wearing, for example, or whatever, something like that, right? Your brain filters out almost everything, and there's a
Yes.
sort of relevance realization, to use the term of Dr. Um, oh gosh, what was his name? Well, it doesn't matter. Vervaeke. There we go. Vervaeke. God, John Vervaeke does some work in Toronto. Anyway, so the idea is relevance realization is this hard problem of, for example, creating a general artificial intelligence is extraordinarily difficult because of this very problem. And we can have this problem when we get into a state where we have an old memory that still upsets us, that's still emotionally charged. That charge hasn't been stripped because partly we're not getting enough REM sleep. That's another function of REM, is to strip the emotional charge of a memory. And what the memory mechanism is for is being able to avoid things that will hurt us in the future. So basically, like, what is salient in the world? What's the thing that I need to pull to my attention and pay attention to? What I should pay attention to, how I perceive, is a massive. It's the thing that consciousness does. It's a little mysterious about how that works, but if you have a memory that's not been processed, then your ability to perceive properly and to realize things that should be relevant to your story is sort of run afoul. And so I'm curious your thoughts on kind of that um, um, layer of how processing works, and then if you can expand on other ways in which we can do that.
The question, you just said a lot right there. And I'm wondering if we need to talk about brain spotting a little bit, because I think that kind of adds an additional layer,
Hmm.
is what I think we need to do. If that's
Yeah.
okay with you.
Yeah. Tell us
Yeah.
about brain spotting.
Yeah. So, I like telling a little bit of a story about how it was discovered and how things work. And so, David Grand is the one who discovered brain spotting, and he used to be an EMDR trainer, and he would go all around the world and teach other mental health professionals how to do EMDR. And so he would do the eye movements, and he figured that there are just some people who don't respond very well to EMDR. And so what he decided to do was he decided to add music. So he would have clients wear headphones with soothing music, and then he slowed down the eye movements, because when you're doing EMDR, there are specific ways of like when we go fast and when we go slower, and that's all in the protocol. So he slowed things down, and he has a great book. It's called Brain Spotting. His name is Dr. David Grand, and he tells the story in the very first chapter of an ice skater named Karen, and he's doing EMDR with her, and he is moving his fingers across her visual field, and he notices that her, and I should say this, they've been in therapy for about a year now. She is getting ready to go to the Olympics. She is just like having this issue landing this like triple axel loop. She's really, really struggling. And so she's coming to him for therapy, but also like performance enhancement. So he's doing EMDR, and he's moving his fingers across her visual field very, very slowly. And what he's noticing is that as he's moving his fingers across the visual field, that he sees her eyes kind of like wobble, like they do something interesting.
Hmm.
And he's like, okay, something must be going on here. So he just holds his fingers in that spot, and he's just kind of like, hey, bear with me. Let's just see what happens. And he asks her to look at that specific area where her eyes wobbled. And they do this for about 10 minutes. And Karen, the ice skater, describes having all of these memories and thoughts and ideas and things popping up in her mind. And a lot of things that she says like were never processed in therapy, like fights that her parents had that she witnessed, like her grandmother dying, like all these things are just like flashing through these memories. And after about 10 minutes, they kind of like decide to wrap up the session, and she discloses what was happening internally for her. And they're kind of like, okay, like that was weird. Like, thanks for giving it a try. See you next time. And so Karen goes to her ice skating practice the following day. She lands this triple axel loop, and she never has a problem again.
Hmm.
And it's incredible. And so I think that there's like this extra layer that's happening with brain spotting that I think kind of alludes to your question, but also alludes to what you asked about or what you mentioned earlier of, and I do this all the time whenever I do a lecture. I'll ask the audience a question, and I normally ask something that's very non-provoking. So what I will ask our audience here is just to take a minute and to think about the best gift that you've ever gotten. And just think about what that is. Maybe that was a birthday gift, a holiday gift, an anniversary gift, something. And we kind of already gave it away, but what I ask people to do afterwards is to notice where their eyes went.
Hmm.
Because our eyes, very interestingly and also a little bit gross, is your eyes are an outgrowth of the brain. They are an exposed piece of the brain.
Mhm.
And so as our eyes are moving, just like what you talked about earlier, they that is showing us an outward manifestation of what's happening inside the brain. So, when I ask you to open up your gift file, if you will, your brain is kind of looking around and it's like, oh, yeah, the Easy Bake Oven that I got for Christmas when I was 6 years old. That's it right there. And so your eyes are telling us where that memory is being held. And that's what we call a brain spot. Very cool. And we can have hundreds of thousands of brain spots for lots of different things. And that includes trauma, but it's not limited to trauma. Our memories are held all over the place in different brain spots. So, what is happening with the therapy of brain spotting? And just to kind of give your audience an overview, with EMDR, it is very structured. It is very much by the protocol. Um, there is significantly less talking compared to talk therapy, but there is still talking, probably like every 2 minutes. I ask what's coming up for you, and there's a little bit of talking, but then we keep processing. Whereas with brain spotting, what is very interesting, and the reason why it's a go-to for me with my first responders or folks who may not be very interested and open to talking, is we have this acronym when you go through brain spotting training, and it's called WAIT. Why am I talking? And it's for the therapist to basically think to ourselves, get out of the way. And the premise is if you broke a leg, broke a bone, whatever, you go to the hospital, they set it, they put it in a cast, and it can heal itself. The premise is that with the brain, we can do the same thing if we set up the right conditions and then we get out of the way. So the way that we do that with brain spotting is we ask the person what is it that they want to work on. We get them to talk about it just a little bit. You give me like the cliff notes. Then I'll ask, what is it that's happening in your body? So we're very much anchoring into the somatic. And then I'll ask, like on a scale from 0 to 10, 0, no distress at all, 10, I couldn't feel more distressed. Where are you? So I can have a baseline, I can have an idea of where you are. And then a lot of times there are people who can feel things in their body. Sometimes there are people who can't. And if that's the case, there are other ways where you can do brain spotting, but I'm not going to get into that because that's kind of like a little rabbit hole. But for the most part, people are like, oh, yeah, like my heart feels so heavy, or my chest, or my hands are sweating, or whatever the case may be. Oftentimes, people can anchor into some type of somatic sensation. So then what we do as the brain spotting therapist is that we have a pointer, and you can kind of think of it as like an old school professor who would like extend the pointer and like, show you on the board what's happening. So I'm just gonna use my pencil right here. Oh, if you can see it. So essentially what we'll do is we'll move across the visual field horizontally first, and we'll ask the person to kind of just get in touch with that body sensation. And just for this example right now, I will say that it is heaviness in the chest. So I'll move my pointer across the visual field very, very slowly, just asking the person to get in touch with the feeling in their chest. And we can go back and forth as many times as we need to. But normally people, especially if it's their first time, they're like, what the hell is this? But again, I often find that a lot of people who end up in my therapy room are kind of at their wits' end. They don't care what it is. They don't ask, they just want to feel better. And I think that that is how I end up with a lot of people who are willing to do brain spotting with me, is that they don't care. They just want to feel better. And oftentimes, I have no problem talking about the science. I love doing that. And some people are like, cut it. I just want to feel better. Like, let's
Yeah.
get to the therapy. So we'll move across the visual field and oftentimes people are like, "Oh, yeah, actually, that's it right there." Like they can identify it. And as I'm explaining this, people listening are probably thinking like, "Oh my, how are you gonna feel something different?" And it really truly does work. So we'll find a spot on the horizontal line, and then once we find that spot, we'll just say that it's right here. Then I will move vertically. I'll move up and down, and again, seeing where that sensation in the body is strongest. And then essentially, and I do a demo like this very often whenever I go and do lectures, and it turns out to be a very boring demo because once we find the brain spot, we'll just say it's like right here. All I do is I ask the person to stare at it, and I tell them that you may see things like you're seeing them on a movie screen in your brain. You may hear things, maybe that's music, conversation, glass breaking, whatever. You may feel things like tightness in the chest, butterflies in the stomach, tingling in the hands, whatever. And then there might also be a little bit of movement too, like muscle twitching, things like that. And I'll just let the person know ahead of time, like, this is normal, allowed to happen. Again, this movement is kind of like the body discharging this like negative energy that it needs to get rid of. And then I go with the acronym WAIT. Why am I talking? So I get out of the way. I mean, obviously I'm there, I'm in the therapy room, and I have my pointer out and I just ask the person to stare at the pointer and I remain silent. I will kind of give some encouragement. And if the person wants to talk out loud, they can. Sometimes people like doing that and processing and talking out loud. Sometimes people prefer to be more internal, but I'm there with them the whole time. I'm attuned, and it is truly incredible what happens in the brain. And that, like I told you about Karen, a lot of things are flashing through with regard to memory, but also it's our neural networks, and they're so incredibly connected. And you may think, well, I wanted to process this triple axle loop that I can't land. Why is it bringing up the death of my grandmother and the fights that I watched my parents go
Mm-hmm.
through? And yet somehow the brain has connected all of these neural networks together. And so when we're seeing these things flashing through, for our rational mind, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But the brain, this third party, the brain has connected them some way, and they know they're connected. So we have a bunch of different things happening, but we also are incorporating bilateral stimulation into brain spotting with the music that we put on. And this is only if the person is interested, but normally it's very nice and soothing. It's normally, ocean sounds or something. And it is, and anybody can listen to this for free. I can give you the link. People can listen to it. And it is music that has been created purposely to move back and forth from left to right. And essentially, that is activating the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. So it's acting like it is rocking a baby to sleep, essentially. Like it's that very soothing sensation. So we have a couple of various different things going on we've got the bilateral stimulation. Once we find the brain spot, we kind of talk about it like dropping in, and that's maybe more like therapist lingo. But what I mean when I say that is the prefrontal cortex is where we have all of our executive functioning, we're pros and cons, like our personality, like a lot of like rational thought is happening here. But the prefrontal cortex needs to get in touch with the amygdala. And the amygdala is like this smoke alarm, this panic. It's it's telling our brain that it's time to panic. And so the prefrontal cortex may know, no, this trauma happened 8 years ago. I'm not in danger right now. But the amygdala's like, I smelled that smell, and that smell means, we're in danger. Like, do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Mm-hmm.
freaking out. But this part of the brain is like, no, we're cool. We're good. Look around. There's nothing happening. So in brain spotting, we get these two pieces of the brain to talk to each other. So it's very complex in the various different layers that are happening. So again, I'm going to pause here because I just gave you a ton of information about brain spotting. And again, like the mystery of what we
Mm-hmm.
believe is happening behind it.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff. What I'm really kind of interested in here too is how you mentioned with the idea of I'm an athlete and I'm trying to do this thing and somehow the death of my grandmother is getting in the way. And rationally you're like, no, put it in it like especially the way my brain works is like category for this, category for that. But the
Hmm.
reality is that the way that the brain talks to itself and how the different areas talk to each other, it's not merely modular, but it's there's a map. There's a map for every memory. And so you may have heard how for the listener, the sensory experience that's usually most closely tied to a traumatic memory is olfactory sensation. Why? Because the part of the brain that processes smell, your olfactory sensors, is closely located to the amygdala. And so neurons that fire together wire together. And so if even just the mechanical proximity of certain brain areas that process certain things to others can overlap these areas. And so what it sounds like with brain spotting, what's happening is it's allowing a new relationship to occur between these different processing centers. Another example of this is if somebody has post-traumatic stress or some other I'm not going to go into like the clinical diagnoses here because I have a
Yeah.
whole thought about that, but we're not going to get into that right now.
Hmm.
Effectively, let's say you have an old memory that still upsets you, right? Meaning that when the memory comes up, you have an emotional charge to the memory.
Right.
Over a long period of time, as you were just talking about with the amygdala and the sort of internal watchtower, if the memory has not been consolidated, what will happen mechanically in the brain is that there's a sort of seesaw balance between a part of the brain called the septum and you already mentioned the amygdala. The septum is part of the limbic system, which processes emotion. The septum is in charge of excitatory activity. So you're looking forward to a thing, you're excited for the thing, and it's like positive excitement. And it's in a seesaw balance with the amygdala versus like, no, we need to be excited in the other direction. And then the prefrontal cortex also has channels that connect down to the amygdala. What happens in cases with people who have old memories that still upset them? You mentioned before how cortisol basically binds with the hippocampus. So if you're getting lost in these terms of the brain, we'll land the plane here to where
Sorry,
it
guys.
makes sense. So the hippocampus again is a memory consolidation portion of the brain, and cortisol, of course, being it's sort of like you'd rather have a false positive than the false negative. In other words, if you're a prairie dog and you detect that there's danger, it's safe, better safe than sorry, right? Better safe than
Right.
sorry is the idea.
That's how we survive. That's how we pass on our genes.
Exactly. And so that's why cortisol can be such a powerful survival mechanism because you can only be so happy, but you can be very dead. And so the brain biases towards these things.
Hmm.
With with the way that our brain talks to itself, the when the amygdala is overactivated and strengthened, sort of like a muscle, the signals override the septum, and then the signals from or the channels from the prefrontal cortex, the sort of logic rational area, are atrophied to the amygdala. So then, even when if someone were to tell you like, hey, it's no big deal. You're in the here and now. It's okay. You don't have to be all upset like that. You need to understand that for the felt experience of that individual, there's a mechanical change within the brain
Hmm.
where the signals are simply not getting to the sort of brainstem area that are keeping you alive. And so it sounds like with brain spotting, what we're actually doing is we're working with the plasticity of the brain to start creating new relationships with one portion over another.
Absolutely. And I think the point that you just made was so good about the amygdala, kind of like a muscle getting stronger, because there is information out there to show that the amygdala actually can increase in size a bit too, whenever it just continues to be activated and activated again in these folks who have been experienced traumatic events and just continue to be triggered. So, yes, there is kind of a rewiring and playing on the neuroplasticity of the brain. And that's what's so beautiful about it is that the brain can change. And I like to describe it as think about a field and it's just got beautiful grass and wildflowers. And if we walk and we just walk over the same portion over and over and over again, eventually, like we will kill that grass. Eventually, we'll get down to the dirt and we will have built a path essentially if we just keep walking back and forth over that same area. And that's what I describe to folks whenever they're having some type of trauma response and being triggered by something. And so I talk about with EMDR and brain spotting is that we're learning to walk in other areas of this field because we
Mm,
do have the ability to do that. And we do have the ability that when we're walking in other different areas and we're not on that same path over and over again, that that very strong path can weaken and that we can strengthen other things. It just takes work and time, but the brain is beautiful like that.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's another nugget of this episode is that if you feel like you're fighting against yourself, there is some truth in that. And part of that was your brain trying to protect you. And so you can almost, if you even want to almost talk to yourself or talk to that sort of monkey mind and dismiss it, is say something like, hey, thank you for taking care of me. I'm okay now. And then practicing that. And so I want to turn this conversation into like you've mentioned EMDR, you've mentioned some brain
Yeah.
spotting stuff. What's somebody who's listening to this and maybe is like, I'm not sure about doing that therapy right now, but is there anything I can do at home to kind of process, to just something that's practical that I can do day to day?
Practical, simple, easy. One thing that I'll say, and we talked about this earlier, is a lot of times I'll ask people, okay, what are your go-to coping mechanisms? Like, how do you blow off steam? And a lot of people look at me like with a puzzled look, and I'm like, I know you have something. Come on. And oftentimes it's exercise. That's a lot of what people will say. And so if you're not ready to do therapy yet, I would say that that is an excellent, very low bar, something that people probably already enjoy. So that's one thing. If you are already doing that and you want to try something else, I think that journaling could be a very nice option for you. I know that a lot of people don't love to do that, but give yourself the chance. Like one of the things that I'll say is that, again, a lot of my folks are public safety, they're veterans, they're active duty, and like working out is their one go-to thing. Well, God forbid something happens and you break your leg. Okay, well, working out is no longer an option for you. So whenever you only have one tool in your toolkit and something happens to that tool, well, we're shit out of luck. So we have to put more tools in our toolkit. So, and also using multiple tools whenever we can, because that's a big part of it is you may know how to do all these things, but unless you're practicing them, unless you're doing them and you only bring them out whenever it's emergency, that makes it really challenging. And I'm going to talk about Dan Siegel's hand brain for a hot second. So, for those of you watching, I have my hand up, and, or if you are only listening, I have my thumb kind of folded in, and the thumb is meant to be the amygdala. And again, that's the area of the brain that is kind of like the smoke alarm. It is just firing and firing off our fight or flight. And then if you bring your fingers down over the hand, and it's kind of like your knuckles and your fingernails are kind of like the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is again where we're rational, like we've got a good head on our shoulders, we can think straight. Well, whenever something happens that is upsetting to us or triggering, I call it flipping your lid. And this is kind of like a very kid-friendly way to explain it.
Mhm.
But whenever you flip your lid and your prefrontal cortex goes offline, it's very hard to remember what coping skills you have, like what things make you feel better. Just it's hard to think of anything other than this fight or flight and panic and feel scared and fear and everything else. So we have to do whatever we can to try and bring the prefrontal cortex and put our lid back in place where it belongs. And so this also might sound kind of silly, but I like to tell my clients about coping cards. So you can make them out of post-its, index cards, whatever you've got. You could, put a list on your phone, but of a list of various different tools that you can use whenever you are in a situation where you're stressed. So for me, maybe my coping cards might look like yoga, going on a walk, going and taking 10 deep breaths, calling a good friend. And so when I am in a situation where my lid is flipped and I can't think straight, and I know that I have things that make me feel better, but I can't think of a single thing in this moment, then I go to the coping cards and I'm like, oh yeah, I could do this. I could do this. Yeah, that would probably make me feel a little bit better. So I would say that this is going to be very unique to each person, but I recommend making the coping cards. And again, this is an excellent exercise if you've got kids, if you've got like nieces or nephews, like make this a fun project. Make it like a little art project, like have markers and pens and pencils and make it something fun and carry it around with you or keep it somewhere where you can often see it so you can remind yourself of all the coping skills that you have and that you can engage in them and use them frequently, not just when it's an emergency.
Hmm. Yeah, anything that brings sort of a visual to what's going on under the hood, I think can be really helpful for people. And I think often, and I wonder if you have any experience of this as well. Maybe it's for men more than women, or maybe not, where you almost feel like you're frustrated that you can't control yourself. Like when if there's a lashing
Yeah.
out, if there's a sort of fear response, and then you berate yourself for being, in the sort of type one fast thinking brain, and then that it's like this vicious cycle. But what I'm hearing here with this sort of flipping the lid, the way that you're describing it is like this is actually there's a sort of normal biological thing that your body
Yes.
does. And
Hmm.
so if we were to sort of layer in a little bit of like a spiritual perspective on this, it's like, hey, you're there's grace here for you for that. And it happens to everyone, and
Yes.
your body is performing a function. There's no function in the body that's morally wrong. And if you happen to experience that, then there's like a sense in which, if you step on a Lego and let's say you're trying to be non-reactive and suddenly your body's like, quick react, and you're like, oh no, I messed up. Like, okay, okay. When the lion initially jumps out of the bushes or whatever, your body is going to respond without you thinking, right? There's a reflex circuitry in the brain that's for you. But then you can run into problems where that reflex circuitry is so hypertrophied, like, made big and strong,
Yeah.
that
Hmm.
in the home environment, it's like, listen, I know cognitively there aren't lions everywhere, but my body is still reacting that way.
Hmm.
Um, so first off, I would say, like, give yourself grace that this is not some sort of commentary on your character or personal constitution. It's just the way that your body has learned how to respond. And so I'm curious, are there other examples of how can we go about continuing to rewire the brain such that that fight or flight or the reflex mechanism isn't so hypertrophied and you're giving more blood flow and healing to other parts of the brain?
That's a great question. And I would say my first thought is therapy. But if people aren't open to that, there are ways that we can build on brain plasticity and we can do various different things. And the first thing that's coming to mind, and again, it might sound really silly, but if you're used to doing things in a certain way, try and change it up. And again, sounds a little silly, but if you're used to driving to work the same way every day, or if you're used to going to the grocery store and going down the aisles in the exact same pattern, go to a different grocery store, go to work a different way. These are going to be ways in which we are teaching the brain to be plastic, to do other things. Because whenever we get into that mode of automaticity and I got in the car and I got to work, but I don't know how that happened,
Hmm.
that's a problem. Like when we get into that autopilot. And so what I'm asking you to do is I'm asking you to force your brain to do things differently. Do things out of order. Brush your teeth with your left hand. Like do things differently and that's going to start to teach the brain there are other paths other than this one that we've been going on the whole time.
Yeah,
And there's lots of ways you can put that into play.
I love that idea, and the it does sound a little silly at first, but you also have to consider these skills generalize. And so if you're stuck and if you feel as if your body is stuck in responding in a single way all of the time, it's like life is now narrowed down to this one stimulus response pattern. But then even in sort of benign things like the route to work that you mentioned, the brushing the teeth differently that you mentioned, you're telling your nervous system that by doing something novel, it is not threatening. And actually, that's kind of the reverse of trauma if you think about it. Trauma is like, I did something that I thought was secure, and it turns out it was threatening, and someone died, or I got hurt, or fill in the blank. And so I love this idea of there's actually a scale that we use in Mission 22 called the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory that was developed back in, I think, the early 90s. And basically, there are 5 dimensions of post-traumatic growth. And one of the ones that's most intriguing to me is this idea of new possibilities. One of the questions I often ask for folks coming out of our program is, what new possibilities have you been considering lately? And it's precisely for that reason.
Yeah, just teaching your brain that there are other things to think about, that there are other ways to go about doing things and creating new and different connections. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
The brain
And
is a
so
beautiful thing.
it's really cool how, like, and even in cases where someone has a phobia that they're getting over,
Mhm.
if they go through a course of treatment, whatever that looks like, and it turns out that the treatment was efficacious, you'll find that that individual has more confidence everywhere else. So it's not just that you have to come get over your fear of elevators, it's that you're building confidence and bravery as such everywhere. Um, and so, yeah, it's a really cool way of, and it also makes life more fun. If you curiosity can override fear responses.
Yeah, I purposefully do this. I try to do this often. Um, because I love neuroplasticity, but also it is just kind of interesting to go out of your way and to do something different. And so I try very hard to practice what I preach. And so I encourage people, again, I'm trying to give you like very low bar strategies for you to just test things out and see how they go.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into a question that we got from an audience member. Jackie
Okay.
asks, any tips to make EMDR more effective and any follow-up treatment options that would be that would be great. And so it kind of sounds like, are there other things that we can do to augment the efficacy, the usefulness of doing something like an EMDR?
I love I love EMDR and I love brain spotting, but I would say I was trained in EMDR and certified in it first, and then later down the road I found brain spotting and became certified in it. And so I would say that if this person and like sidebar before the podcast started recording, she had told me that she had been in EMDR for 6 months. And normally what we find is that people do tend to feel better, not cured, better in 1 to 3 sessions. And I would be interested in talking to the person to see, okay, you've been doing EMDR for 6 months. Has this been weekly for 6 months? Where did you start? Where are you feeling now? What feels like it's still hanging on? So I'd want to gather a lot more information about that. But I would suggest brain spotting because again, whenever people come into my office, now that I have both of these tools, like 9 times out of 10, I pick brain spotting over EMDR because I think that it is much more flexible. Um, with EMDR, people can get overwhelmed. And at any point in time, you let your therapist know, and we will stop and we'll course correct and we'll do other things. But with brain spotting, there's just a lot of ways to correct in real time. So, I had kind of given you the example of like, okay, if our spot's here, and then you tell me, okay, I'm starting to feel kind of overwhelmed. So, what I'll say to you is, okay, look through my fingers and all the way back to the back wall. And that can be something that it is like an easy way to course correct to do something that's less distressing, but we're still processing and we're still in it. So I think that whenever it comes to brain spotting, I think that there's so much flexibility and, we could get into it even deeper. You can do double spotting, so you can have a spot for something that is traumatic that you're working on, but then you can also have a spot of something really wonderful. So let me give you an example. I guess should ask how much time do we have?
We're good.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So I worked with an individual, and I'm not going to give any information away, but he had been in an experience where he was overseas, he was deployed, he was shot at, and didn't have any armor on, hid behind someone who did, kind of peeked out and saw that it was a child. And this was obviously just very distressing, being shot at, not having any armor on, and then to see that the person who's shooting at you is a child. And so that was all that happened with the traumatic event, but we decided to brain spot on it because it was just something that really stuck with this particular individual. So we had a spot of what actually happened in the event, and then I asked him to think, okay, so in your mind, we're gonna like take your brain off its leash and we're gonna suspend reality. If anything could have happened in this situation, what would you have liked to have happened? And basically he interacts with the child. They don't speak the same language, but somehow they do, and kind of just gets to know this child and they're kind of just spending time together. And so that's what he would have preferred to happen in this situation. And again, like whenever I'm doing brain spotting, it's what feels right to you. So I let the client figure out whatever this narrative is going to be. So I found a spot for him where, okay, this is the spot where the actual event happened, and this is the spot where you like the ideal event or what you prefer would have happened. And so what we can do is you can spend time in the traumatic event spot, but if it feels like it's getting too distressing, you can bounce your eyes over to this spot and you can kind of spend time wherever your eyes want to spend time. And we can do that for a lot of different things, but that's just one example that came to the top of my mind was double spotting and being able to do that. And something else that I want to mention, and also a reason why I like doing brain spotting more so, is that we can do things called like expansion spotting. So if this is something that you want to work towards, that you want to grow towards, that you want to imagine seeing yourself as someone who isn't triggered all the time, who kind of imagining your most ideal self, we can find a spot for that too, and we can kind of anchor into that, and it's much more of like a strength based way to do processing. So there's so many possibilities, and I'm constantly hearing about really interesting, cool things that are happening in the brain spotting community. But that's if just to go back to the question, and this person having done EMDR for 6 months, I would want to gather more personalized information from them, but then I would suggest, well, hey, why don't we give brain spotting a try and see, what this works for you? Because and also too, like, what are the coping skills that you have? What are the things you're doing outside of therapy? Because those do matter too. If you're going to therapy 1 hour a week, okay, what are you doing with all the other hours in your week too? And are those things supporting your progress and your healing and your journey, or are you doing things that maybe are taking you in the wrong direction?
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that stood out to me there was the kind of reprocessing of an old memory and how that it's you can't underestimate just how much your mind can adapt around old memories. You might not be able to change the literal thing that happened as recorded by a security camera, but you can absolutely change your relationship to it. And it almost sounded like in the story that you were telling, I'm just imagining that if we were to play that out, that guy or whoever it was had a sort of forgiveness moment. And I'd be fascinated to know what happens in the brain if you process through forgiving.
Absolutely. So this also very much ties into sleep. So this particular event that that happened to this man happened years and years ago, but it still stuck with him. And he said that he would think about it like at least daily. But also, one of the ways that we came to working together was this would often show up in nightmares. So
Mm,
again, even though it happened years ago, the brain is still attempting to process this. And so I was using brain spotting in addition to imagery rehearsal therapy too, which is kind of a way to rewrite the dreams. But yeah, I think that there's again, the brain is so incredibly plastic, and when it comes to brain spotting, it's just extremely rapid, it's extremely effective, and one fantastic thing, and the reason why I just lean towards it is a lot of it has to do with the therapist kind of going with their gut and kind of being a little bit creative with things because I don't know that there's necessarily, I'm sure that there's a protocol out there because there's tons of them. But in that moment, I was just thinking, what does this person need? And so that's why I asked, what would you have liked to have seen? What would have been the most ideal thing that would have happened? And I do think that there was a forgiveness piece and like, gosh, how sad is it that this is what this child is up to instead of playing on a playground or going and doing kid stuff. So I think that forgiveness is there. There's just so many pieces that come into it. But I say that to say is that EMDR is very manualized. It's if you're doing it by the book, it's very rigid. But with brain spotting, I do think that there's a lot more flexibility for the clinician to shift gears, to see how the person's doing in real time and try and make changes to make it the most effective session that you can possibly have.
hmm Yeah, okay, makes sense. The last question I got here is for somebody who, let's say they've been diagnosed with something, or it's just sort of the way I've heard it is like the wounded well or the walking wounded or something like that. Not the walking wounded,
The
but
worried
basically
well?
the worried well. There we go. Thank you. So basically that describes somebody who's sort of subclinical. Maybe they're not like fully diagnosed or whatever, but they feel like, I could use some help of some sort. Maybe I'm a
Yeah.
little skeptical of therapy or whatever. What would you say to that individual of how to navigate the kind of network of care or formal treatment or less formal treatment? How should they think about that?
I again, one of the things that I just keep coming back to is like brain spotting. Whenever I talk about this, it is incredibly rapid. So if there's something that's bothering you and it continues to bother you and it seems like it's getting in the way of you being able to live your fullest life, there, yeah, you can certainly go schedule an appointment. Like you really don't have anything to lose. Like go give it 3 or 5 sessions and see how you feel. Because I think that there's just a lot of power in having this third non-judgmental party to talk to process things with, and to give you new and different skills. But yeah, I think that, there's so many people out there who do brain spotting, and, I'm coming at it, and this whole episode has been very much from a trauma lens, but those are my specialties are, trauma and sleep. And so that's how most people are attracted to me and how we find each other in the therapy room. However, there are people out there who specialize in brain spotting just for helping you get over your worries and anxiety about money. There are people out there who only specialize in helping you achieve your highest self in brain spotting. So there are lots of people out there who brain spotting is their specialty, but it's something very specific, very special of, yeah, you don't have to be clinical. You don't have to have spent time inpatient. You can still benefit from this. Maybe you might have to pay out of pocket, but again, just figuring out what your mental health is worth. And, in my opinion, psychologist, very biased, it's worth a lot because your mental health is going to color everything that you see, how you interact with the world, how you engage. There's just so many pieces that it touches. And so if you don't feel like things are right, if something seems off, you have very little to lose.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there about the what is it worth to you piece. And yeah, a lot of hesitation I hear from people, like, for example, not wanting to go to a gym, not wanting to pay their own money for a coach. Like,
Yeah.
how would life be different if you had that gym, if you had that coach, if you had that counselor or whatever? Well, and then you start to get them thinking, like, well, I would have a perspective on this. I might be able to finally reach my goals. I mean, how much is that worth to you?
Mhm.
It's a really good question. Um, so
Yeah.
this is,
And
go ahead.
I was going to say we could also do like motivational interviewing around something like that of like, okay, on a scale from 0 to 10, like, how are you feeling about this particular thing right now? Okay, like what would make that closer to 10 is, we definitely want to do this. So what would it take to get there? And I think that there's so much around that. But also I was going to mention, and I think I lost it. That's okay. We talked a lot already.
We
But
did.
yeah, I had something I was going to mention and I lost it.
Well, you've teed us up beautifully for a potential future conversation. Where can listeners and viewers go to keep up with your work?
Yeah, so my website is drleahkaylor.com and I have a small but growing YouTube channel. It's at Dr. Leah Kaylor. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn too.
Great. Well, this has been amazing. And I think we're going to have a follow-up conversation probably later this summer to dive deep into some sleep strategies, nightmare processing, all that good stuff. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time on behalf of the Mission 22 community. We really appreciate what you do, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Mhm.